Hello viewers, welcome to Talking Points, a new initiative by StudyIQ to hear perspectives on interesting issues from key personalities. Today, we are privileged to be joined by Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, currently Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, also an advisor at the Niti Forum for the Northeast. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya had previously served as the Indian Ambassador to Syria, Afghanistan and Myanmar. Born and brought up in Delhi and Patna, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1980 and has since served at key positions at different locations including Mexico, Cuba, the Indian Mission in New York, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Culture, among others. Ambassador, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking your time out.
Pleasure.
You joined the Foreign Services in 1980 after doing your education in Delhi. What motivated you to choose a career in the civil services, and what kind of preparation did you undertake during that time?
Thank you. Well, a pleasure to appear before StudyIQ. Well, nothing in particular. To be very frank, I drifted into the Foreign Service, though there were some cues given by, obviously our elders and people in position. My father was a well-known doctor in Patna, and of course among his many friends he had friends in government and in civil services, and there were several. One of them was a former professor in JNU who later on became India's ambassador in Nepal as well as the then governor in Bihar. This was Mr. Kidwai at that time. Both of them actually advised my father that perhaps I should appear for the Foreign Service, so I should join the Foreign Service. And I think this is something that stuck in my mind. But perhaps the most sort of crucial determinant was right from my school days, I used to have friends whose parents were in the Foreign Service. And since they were close friends, I think this kind of also influenced me a little, that it seemed like an interesting career to pursue. So when the time came to make decisions about where to go in life, I was still in university. I was debating between an academic career, and I felt that maybe a university atmosphere was too cloistered, and I wanted a sense of the real world. And I appeared for the Civil Services exam. At that point, I hadn't quite decided IAS or IFS. In fact, my first choice was actually the first choice was the Foreign Service, but I was really thinking of the administrative service. Somehow, when the results came out, I was high enough in the merit list to actually get the Foreign Service. So I actually landed up there pretty much by accident.
Okay, and civil services is of course considered as one of the most toughest exams in the world. What kind of preparation did you undertake during that time?
Yeah, I think a lot. Your education matters a lot, and I think that gives you a great head start, you might say, where others might have to struggle. You just by virtue of having had a good education, you have an advantage. So essentially, I prepared with the subjects that I had in my college days, which were history and sociology. And later on, I included psychology because I heard that it was a high scoring subject. So, my approach was frankly quite instrumental. When I qualified with, this was the first year in which the new system had been introduced, which was an objective type test first and then, an essay type test. And I appeared in sociology and psychology and scored reasonably good marks, good enough to qualify for the Foreign Service.
Great to know that. You have served in key assignments at various locations around the world. Could you take us through a life of a diplomat, the kind of challenges a diplomat faces and the kind of work that he has to perform on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Okay, this is a big question. So pardon me if I take a little while. In terms of my career, I started off learning Spanish in Mexico. And then from Mexico, I had a posting. I'm not sure if it was immediate. I came back to Delhi, and then I was posted to Mexico. From Mexico, once again, I came back to Delhi. In fact, I served in the media division of the Ministry of External Affairs. And then I got actually a short assignment on deputation from the Ministry of Culture to France, to Paris, for the Festival of India. So I was an IFS officer serving in the Indian Embassy, but on deputation from the Ministry of Culture, against a post from the Ministry of Culture. And immediately after that, I got posted to Cuba. Then from Cuba, once again, I came back. I served in the Ministry of External Affairs in what was then the East Europe Division. And in the East Europe Division, this happened to be the period when, this was the Gorbachev years. The Soviet Union was changing. And eventually, during this period, the Soviet Union also broke up and a new dispensation, came. You had new Russia, and East Europe in its own way broke away. Many republics of Russia itself broke away. So this was a very kind of historic moment in which we had a ringside view. And then following that, I once again came back to the External Publicity Division, where I was serving as a director. And then I went to New York, where I served in the third committee, which essentially deals with social issues, primarily human rights, advancement of women, social development. Served a short while as a consultant to the United Nations on social development, pursuing some of the the big conferences and their follow-up thereafter. Wrote a couple of papers for the UN Secretary General as well, and then came back. Did a short while with the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. Then did the NDC, and it was while I was at the NDC that I was literally plucked out one day and asked if I would head our mission that we were just about to open in Afghanistan, which of course I was very glad to do and very happy to do. And following that, I came back here and served actually 3 years in the Ministry of Defense, which was again a very, very exciting period because, unlike in the Ministry of External Affairs, by and large, where you will cover either an aspect, whether it's trade or disarmament or whatever, or you will cover general political relations relating to a particular part of the world. In the Ministry of Defense, I was dealing with defense partnerships and strategic relations with virtually all the important partners. So it was a very interesting and a very good exposure for me, after which I did my 3 assignments that you mentioned as ambassador. Now, I think that's what I would probably highlight is that the Foreign Service has given me, as it has given many of my other colleagues, a very varied experience, not only of life, but also the world. So we've been very fortunate to be able to meet people in very different parts of the world. Sadly, I have not served in Africa. I have traveled in Africa, but in many parts of the world, in the Arab world, in Europe, in America, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia. So that's a tremendous exposure. I think that's one. Secondly, of course, we've been privileged to have a ringside view on very major historical developments in our own time. Whether it was, as I mentioned to you, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, cataclysmic changes that we are still seeing, or the emergence of the rise and emergence of China as a new power, or the developments that we've seen in our own region. I mean, in particular, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, followed by a period of Mujahideen rule and eventually the Taliban, and then over the last 18 years, a period of democratic rule supported by the international community from outside. Conflicts, for example, I served in Syria. It was a very peaceful country during the period that I was there, but almost soon after I left, the Arab Spring began, and Syria was caught up in the turbulence, and suddenly everything was overturned. And 8 years down the line, from 2011 to now, Syria still remains on the boil and in the news, as is Afghanistan, and for that matter, as is Myanmar. So, yeah, it gives you a lot of thrills. That's what I would say.
Of course, you mentioned, right, that you were there serving at the National Defense College when you were suddenly asked by the government of India to reopen the mission in Kabul in Afghanistan.
Right.
And the US bombings were still going on against the Taliban. Right. Could you share some experiences?
Well, thank you. It was an extraordinary experience, the like of which is rare in anyone's career, and does not happen very often. As I said, I was literally plucked out one day and asked whether I would reopen the mission, and the next day without informing anyone. I took what was then considered it was still a classified flight to reach Kabul. It was an unusual mission in the sense that for the last 5.5 to 6 years, our mission in Kabul had been closed, completely frozen. And when I went there, the situation in Afghanistan, post-Taliban, post-war, post the Mujahideen, was a shattered city and a shattered country. Buildings were, basically blown. The hotel that I was staying in had a huge gaping hole on one side, or where I was put up initially when I came. There was no radio, there was no telephones, there was no television, there were no newspapers. So, in a way, it was a completely blind mission. Even the landing at Bagram Airport was like a phantom airport. You had uh, an Indian aircraft landing at a phantom aircraft without any visible air traffic control, without any visible acknowledgement of our flight landing. And as I said, all that I had was three things. One is I had a medical team. I, of course, had an interpreter and a communications helper and an advisor who had some idea of the layout. My only experience of Afghanistan before that was that as a student in 1977, I had, and this was before the Soviet intervention and so on, I had actually traveled overland by road from Kabul to Europe and back. So I had some acquaintance of Afghanistan. But otherwise, it was a blind mission, and I had to grope and find my way amongst journalists and the new government that was coming in. And all that I had as an instrument was a satellite phone. And we started off the mission like that. We regained access to the embassy, which had been kept closed and had not been vandalized more than a little bit in the beginning. Of course, there were some effects of the war in the sense of bullets or grenades here or there. The Indian embassy residence itself had been used by the Taliban, and that needed to be completely refurbished, which was done by the ambassador who actually took over in a few months from me. The first post-Taliban ambassador in Afghanistan, Ambassador Vivek Karju. And I would report back to Delhi once a day on a satellite phone. And this carried on for about the 3 or 4 months that I was there. Midway while I was there in December, the attack on the Indian Parliament took place. And even that one flight, the flights that used to be able to operate, which were special flights flying over Pakistan, were discontinued. Shortly after that, Ariana resumed, again with its one aircraft in Afghanistan those days, but again with the closure of the airspace and also the deployment of that one plane for Hajj duties. In fact, communication with India was completely broken down. So we just depended on that odd flight that took place once in a while to be able to come and go, which when I returned finally, it was late March 2002. So that was it. And of course, all this while, the US military campaign was going on. This was the period when Osama bin Laden was still known to be or considered to be in Afghanistan, and the Americans were bombarding the Tora Bora areas every day. Kabul airport itself had been shut down because it had been bombarded sometime during the war, so it was not usable. Bagram airport was being used, and we would be hearing planes all the time flying, and we didn't necessarily hear the bombs on a daily basis because bombs were much further away. But the air activity, the Air Force activity was constant and was constantly present. So I think that was the kind of atmosphere. But one thing I must say that by this time, of course, technology, defense technologies had already evolved. Most of the US bombing, at least at that time, was very precision and very targeted. So, for example, there were cases even in Kabul where a particular house, which had been identified as, let's say, terrorist hideouts, they were targeted without seriously affecting the next building, apart from maybe some fire damage or something like that. So that was as close as you get to the battlefield, I think, for a foreign service officer.
It also served as an ambassador to Myanmar during a period when Myanmar was undergoing a transition. Your experiences of of serving in Myanmar, and where do you see the future of Myanmar going in South?
Well, okay, yeah. Speaking about the future is always hazardous, but yeah, I happened to go to Myanmar at a very interesting time. I was in Afghanistan between 2010 and 13, and as you know, around that time, 2010, the then military government decided to, had already crafted a new constitution, and a new government was elected. It was basically a government of ex-military people, but of a kind of reformist orientation. And among the many things they did was they freed Aung San Suu Kyi, who was then under house arrest, a certain amount of media and political liberalization. They also undertook some economic opening, and in particular, they made a very strong diplomatic outreach to be able to re-establish diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. And starting from about 2011, they had considerable success in doing that. So this was a period that a country like Myanmar, which had been closed for all practical purposes from the early 1960s, that was the case, and also had been affected by numerous political and even natural political disturbances and natural calamities. There were the 1988 democracy uprising started off by students. There was the saffron revolution or rebellion that took place of the monks. There was a very bad cyclone that affected Myanmar very severely just a little before I reached there. So Myanmar also had suffered extraordinarily during this period. But I think what I saw was a period of transition, a period of very dignified transition, a period of that showed the extraordinary resilience of the Myanmar people. I think I was lucky to witness the 2015, November 2015 democratic elections, which were the first, free and fair, at least relatively free and fair elections held in Myanmar since the 1960s. I had the opportunity as the head of mission, together with my team, to farm out all over Myanmar and actually observe those elections. And I must say I'm in awe of the way the elections were conducted, the spirit in which it was conducted, the discipline in which it was conducted, and the fact that the results when they came out showed an overwhelming victory, at least in the non-military seats for the NLD, led by a very charismatic Aung San Suu Kyi, and that those results were respected, and we actually had a transition from a kind of it's a quasi civilian regime, but emanating from the military to a democratic and civilian government. Now, the transition has not been perfect. The military remains in power, in substantially also sharing power. It's a form of cohabitation, but again, surprisingly, for 5 years, somehow it has survived. Maybe all the promises that were held out of a full transition and of the kind of freedoms and economic development, particularly the prospects of peace that were peace with the several insurgent groups that are active in Myanmar, that looked very plausible at the time of the transition. That has not happened. But at least Myanmar hasn't slid back down a very slippery slope, in spite of the very major crisis that took place, which had been growing, but that particularly, I think, started from about 2016 and 17, which is, the famous so-called Rohingya crisis. So somehow it has held. Now the next elections will come up, I think 2020, and we will see what kind of transition it is. My guess is that it will remain democratic, and the democratic transition will continue. It is difficult to predict beyond that, I think.
So you had served at the Indian mission in New York at the UN. it's been long demand of India to be included in the P5 of the Security Council for a long time. Do you think that India has a real shot at becoming a member of the permanent council at the Security Council in the near to the midterm future?
Difficult to say. It's quite normal that countries, when they have exclusive privileges which they control, unless they completely agree, and also the fact that it's very difficult to get a complete consensus around any one candidature for such a position, a very exclusive and very privileged position. So it's very difficult to expect that those who already have this, particularly you're talking about the P5, the veto power, that they will relinquish it and allow room for someone else. I think India's credentials are very obvious, and the failure of the United Nations system, the General Assembly and the Security Council, to be able to absorb new and growing powers, as they did for China at one point, is obviously something that will tell on the organization itself. The organization itself will, over a period of time, lack the legitimacy and credibility that it should have. But I don't think it's something that we should bargain for. The fact is that if you have an influence in international affairs, this will largely come from your role, from your economy, and for the kind of international role that you play. And that, if India continues to do, starting off actually, any country, your maximum influence will be in your immediate region. So if India is able to play that positive role, economically and politically, particularly starting off from its region, that influence will be exercised, whether or not you are a permanent member of the Security Council, or a temporary member, and a temporary member that could be elected, or even a permanent member without a veto power, as is being discussed. So, India is a strong candidate, together with Brazil, Germany, and Japan. And if India has not been able to get membership, neither have the other countries. And quite clearly, there's a fair amount of politics about who should be in and maybe who has to be out. And I don't think we should hold our breath on this change taking place. But we should just concentrate on our own development and our own foreign policy.
India recently walked out of the RCEP pact, which is between ASEAN and a few other nations. Do you think the government of India took the right stand by walking out of the pact?
See, two things we have to understand. Of course, it is preferable, it is desirable. I would say this should always remain our objective, to be part of larger and bigger freer trade pacts, and particularly freer trade pacts with our immediate region, and a growing and fast growing region like Southeast Asia and East Asia. This has been actually an objective, in a way, of our Look East policy, and then subsequently our Act East policy. So it's a logical ambition and a logical aspiration, and we should not give it up. And I don't think, from what I have read, we are turning our back to a larger free trade area and the RCP and so on. But there are immediate difficulties. I think we need to understand that if there is a very sudden transition from a kind of, let's say, a protected regime to a much more free and open regime, and particularly with the prospects of a very large impact on the goods sector, on the manufactured goods sector, this is going to have severe repercussions in a country like India, where a very large sector of the population is still vulnerable. And I'm talking about farmers, we are talking about the dairy, we're also talking about all kinds of small and medium enterprises, which will not be able to withstand this competition. Now, every country has to prepare for so-called structural adjustments. But when you're talking about a country like India, 1.3 billion population, the scale of disruption that could take place is something that no democratic government can ignore. It may be an ideal, but you have to face that fact. And I think that is what the government of India finally faced, is at the moment of reckoning, at the moment of truth. And I think this is a commentary also on our own government and over the many years, is that we have been working for this. Ever since we started Look East and Act East, we have known that we need to integrate. We have ourselves agreed to integrate. When we think of connectivity projects, when we think of free trade agreements, as we already have in goods, trades, and even goods, services, and investment with the ASEAN, we are the logical extension of that is the RCEP. And we had all the time in the world, 25 plus years, to be able to prepare for it. And somehow we failed to prepare for it. So the first point I would say is that, yes, it is understandable that we did it. And we did it because we were not prepared for it. And we are not prepared for it. And to that extent, I think it was a responsible decision. But yes, I think it's a failure that we were not able to prepare our population over 2 or 3 decades for this. The third thing that I will mention is, and this could also be a factor in the government's mind, is, the ASEAN countries have, to a certain extent, thanks to their own ASEAN Economic Community, thanks to also support from the West for many of those countries, and of course, much closer presence of China over the last 30, 40 years, they have had the time to acclimatize to these changes, and in some ways, except the poorest of them, they have been well prepared for these transitions. But the government of India, and perhaps India, could legitimately think that, and even Indian business and industry sometimes does think that a 1.3 billion market by itself is a viable market. And there are many businesses in India who don't even look towards going out because they think that this market is big enough. And therefore, this market is, in its own way, a viable free trade market. So, with these factors, I think there are some calculations, but on the whole, I would still say that we were unprepared. We were caught unprepared, and the responsibility for that, to some extent, lies with us. Now, looking to the immediate future, question is, how quickly will you be able to prepare your vulnerable sectors to such changes? Is this going to continue indefinitely, or are you going to work for that change? And if you're going to work for that change, what should be the strategies that you should adopt?
Ambassador, a few months back, the US President, Mr. Donald Trump, had stated that the US would slowly withdraw its troops from Afghanistan in a phased manner. And it is time for other countries to take the lead in the Afghanistan peace process. Your thoughts on the Afghanistan peace process, and where do you see it heading?
Yeah. So there are several points there. One is, look, there is no question that all of Afghanistan is tired of war. I mean, they have been constantly at war in one form or the other, civil or uncivil, for since 1979, which means now 19 plus 21, 40 years. An entire generation has come up only knowing war. It's actually quite understandable that everyone wants peace. So, any effort that is being made towards peace should be welcomed and will be looked at by the Afghans. It will be looked positively by the Afghans. The question is whether the kind of peace that, let's say, the US is negotiating with the Taliban is going to lead to actual peace. What appears to be a peace process is, in the view of many people, not really a peace process. Some people talk about it really as a kind of withdrawal agreement, and a peace process that will follow after that. But a withdrawal agreement that will leave the Afghan government much more vulnerable to, predatory activity from the other side. While the US will withdraw, there is no guarantee that those who are backing the Taliban will withdraw. So, in a way, the balance of forces will be changed to the disadvantage of that generation that has grown up post-war. a generation over the last 18 years, a generation that has, since the dark period of the Taliban, been educated in India and other countries, have come to positions of authority, have uh, have brought about and are creating a modern Afghanistan. And you just have to visit Afghanistan and encounter the youth, just like we were talking yesterday about the youth of the Northeast, the youth of Afghanistan, to realize, what what a period of positive churn Afghanistan is going through. Now, in that context, what is important is that what we've had so far is a number of peace initiatives taken by the United States, Russia, even the Europeans have been engaged, and now, most recently, China has been engaged. Our perception is that many of these peace initiatives are being taken in the interests of those countries themselves. They have their own interests, and they are trying to reach kind of agreements with the Taliban in their own interest. They are not really working for Afghanistan's interest. What we have always stood by, in India, is that we support any peace process, including these, but we particularly support an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and increasingly we say Afghan-controlled peace process, because sometimes it may appear to be Afghan-led or Afghan-owned, but it's not really Afghan-owned or controlled. So we think that the best chances of peace come from an Afghan-owned, Afghan-led, and Afghan-controlled peace process. The first requirement for that, the government of Afghanistan has said very often that they are willing to negotiate with the Taliban unconditionally. Now they have put some red lines after the elections. But I think the first precondition is that the Taliban should agree to talk to their fellow Afghans. Once we have the beginning of an intra-Afghan talk, ideally accompanied by a ceasefire, because of course you need conditions for talks. I mean, technically it's possible to fight and talk at the same time, but clearly, you will have a much better atmosphere and environment for talks if there is a ceasefire, and if civilians are not being killed, indiscriminately from day to day. So I think the first thing that the international community should now do is prevail upon the Taliban to initiate and start intra-Afghan talks with the government, but with also with the full involvement of the government, but obviously with a representative Afghan government that covers all the political forces, so that all the political forces in Afghanistan, including the Taliban, are represented. And whatever agreement that comes out of that, this is an Afghan agreement. I have no doubt that the government of India will respect such an agreement. But an agreement that is made in the interest of outside powers, that is partial, that is imbalanced, that does not also meet the demands of the new generation, which is that there should be no return of the reversal of the gains of the last 18 years, that will not be a sustainable peace. And my own feeling is that sooner or later that would break down. If you want a sustainable peace, it has to be based on compromise on both sides, and it has to be based on all parties being involved, and it has to be based on an agreement amongst Afghans themselves. And then the international community should be able to support and guarantee those agreements.
Finally, Ambassador, a large number of our viewers are very passionate about the civil services. Your tips to them on how they should go ahead, in order to successfully ace the exam.
Right. So there is the exam part of it. I think the exam part of it, it's been a long time since I did the exams, and I'm sure the exams themselves have evolved. But if there are certain, the competition has evolved. But if there are a couple of basic things, I think, look, it doesn't require extraordinary intelligence. What it requires is just basic good knowledge and common sense. And I think common sense is a primary prerequisite of any of the civil services and administrative services. Common sense, objectivity, impartiality, commitment. I think these are the four qualities that I would say, if one has these qualities, they show up in your exams, they show up in your interviews, they show up in your career, they show up in your promotions, and they show up in your contribution to the country, which is, after all, the basic reason why you're there, which is to serve the people of the country. So I would say yes. It doesn't require, it doesn't require brilliance. Everyone has a chance, but what it requires is common sense and a certain commitment to serve the people. And I think that would be my advice to people for doing that. Get your basics right. The exams are not testing you on the extremes of knowledge, on the frontiers of knowledge. They are testing on whether your basics are right. To get your basics right, you should qualify.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for taking your time out and sharing your thoughts on the exam and, of course, on your experiences as an ambassador for the country.
My pleasure. Anything to be able to share my experience with the youth of the country, and in order to be able to contribute to the future of this great country, a democracy of 1.3 billion people, scientific and industrial power, and a strong military.
With that, we come to the end of today's interview with Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. Till next time, tune in to StudyIQ.